Welcome to the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This podcast is dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like all the best bookshops, this podcast is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. So tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book at the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. I'm Stacey Horan, author, book lover, and host of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This is episode number 194. For more information about this or any of our episodes, go to my website, staceyhoran.com. If you enjoy the podcast, leave us a review, like us on social media, and share us with your friends, family, and fellow readers. In today's episode of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet, I'm chatting with author C.J. Milacci about the first two books in her Talionis series, Recruit of Talionis and Fugitive of Talionis. These sci-fi dystopian novels were written for the young adult audience, but fans of C.J.'s series vary in age, with the youngest fan being just 10 years old and the oldest being 98. In this series, the main character, Bria, is a young woman haunted by personal tragedy who is kidnapped to become a recruit in an army of secret soldiers, forced to fight in a war that she wants no part of. What was CJ's inspiration for this series? She started with a question. What would happen if America fell like Rome did, while the rest of the world moved on and abandoned the survivors of America's collapse? From CJ's answer to that question, the Talionis series was born. In this episode, I'll chat with CJ about her writing journey, the reason she became a fan of plotting out her stories, and what she really loves about dystopian novels, as well as a few other things, coming up. C.J. Milacci, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Stacey. I'm excited to be here.
I thought what we could do today is talk about your new series. You now have two books out in the Talionis series. Maybe what you could do is introduce us to this young adult sci-fi dystopian series and give us a bit of the inspiration you had in writing it.
Of course, I started writing this series because I love dystopian books. So I love imagining a world where everything that could go wrong does, which probably sounds a little terrible, but there's something about diving into the possibilities and the what ifs, and then how can something good come out of so much destruction and difficulty. So that was sort of the seed that started the story brewing in my mind. And the Talionis series follows Bria Averton, who is a 17-year-old girl who has grown up in North America near the city that is the ruins of Portland, Maine. And it is years after what has become known as the demise of North America. And there was a world war and America was completely destroyed. And there are pockets of survivors, but the rest of the worlds continued on in their war and left the survivors of North America kind of alone. So Bria grew up in this town where there's not a lot of tech, where it's kind of that old school home, small town world. And that's all she's ever known. She walks by piles of debris from the demise because, that's something that happened in the past, but it's not something that affects her. And the thing that really eats away at her is things that have happened in her own past, and one of which is revealed early in the first book is the death of her younger brother, and there is guilt in her life because of that. So she's living this life in this small town, and then one day she wakes up and she has been kidnapped and she's alone, away from her family. She's surrounded by soldiers and teens, and then she's brought to the city called Talionis, which is a city that is a secret military base for a country in another part of the world. And it is built on the ruins of what was once Philadelphia, which is right near where I live. And the story follows Bria as she's thrust into this world of becoming a recruited soldier for Talionis. And she doesn't want to be. She's trying to escape, but soon finds that escape is impossible. And she fears drowning in the depths of the evil of the city and becoming who they want her to become. But yet she doesn't know how to escape or find an alternative way out. So book one really follows her as she makes friends in unlikely places and forms allies, and then starts to discover ways that maybe she could get out of this city and do something to stop the antagonist, Demetrius Arc, who is the commander of the city and ruling the whole place. And so book one is the story of the fight in Talionis, and then book two, Fugitive of Talionis, follows Bria after a lot of events that happen in book one. So I'm not sure how spoilery you want me to get there.
Well, let's pause there, because what I want to do is talk a bit more about Bria. Tell us a bit more about her and how you developed her as a character.
Sure. So Bria is a character who has a lot of strengths, but also some very glaring weaknesses as well. She can be fiercely protective, but then sometimes goes to the extreme and speaks out when she shouldn't and gets herself in trouble. But one of the things I really wanted to explore with her character is, how do you handle a crazy traumatic situation where you're thrust into this life of becoming a soldier? It's a totally different experience. Talionis has tech and all this stuff that she's never experienced before in her life. And now she's put in this whole new world away from everything she once knew. But then she also has her own history and trauma and struggle that she hasn't recovered from, she hasn't healed from. And our histories and our struggles follow us. And I kind of wanted to explore with her, what does it look like to fight through your own past while also fighting in a place where there's a lot of bad things happening? And can you find hope in that? Can you overcome there? Is it possible, or does it all just end up overcoming you? And I wanted with her character to kind of explore some of those questions. And she was a lot of fun to write, and kind of let me be a little sassy at times and speak out, through her in ways that maybe I wouldn't have done personally, but she has that little bit of a spunk in her that I really enjoyed getting to explore. And she is a character that will, once she is your friend, once she is decides to trust you, she is very loyal and she will fight to protect those people that she loves and cares about, which I love that part of her personality and her character as well.
And as far as the supporting characters go, I'm always curious if authors have sort of a favorite among the supporting cast. Usually authors enjoy the main character because that's the one that speaks most loudly to them.
Sure.
But of the supporting cast, were there any that you really enjoyed writing? Any of those voices you really enjoyed having in your head?
Yes. Without a doubt, Nika is my favorite. She might even be one I like more than Bria, which is bad to say. But I do always feel like I'm picking a favorite child when I do this. But Nika was and is probably one of my favorite characters to write. She's very, very no nonsense. She kind of keeps her head down, does what she's got to do, but calls people out under her breath, So she's also been kidnapped and she's forced to become a soldier. And she's one of Bria's roommates. And she is the person who will just be like, girl, what are you doing? This is ridiculous. And not really standing up, but yet she doesn't like what's happening too. But she's just kind of feisty. And I like her sass and her character a lot. And I find when I'm writing her that I have a lot of fun with her character and her attitude and everything. And she's also just a really strong person. She has a lot she's been through herself, and yet it's made her stronger. And I think I love to have that personality alongside of Bria because it shows her that her past can actually be something that makes her stronger and doesn't destroy her.
Yeah. When you were coming up with the idea for this book, what was the spark for you? Was it the characters that came to you first? Was it a line of dialogue, a particular scene you had in your head, just a world building idea? What was the spark that sort of started you down this road?
Oh, that's such a great question. And I think that it was sort of a series of sparks, like different things that came together. But one of the first things was the question of, what would happen if, like how Rome fell when it was at the height of its glory, right? And then it fell, it crumbled, and the rest of the world moved on. What if that happened to America? What if America, which is a world power, then suddenly fell and was crippled, and the rest of the world just moved on and left the survivors alone? And then what would happen if there was somebody who came back with this whole plot of revenge himself and decided to kidnap teens? And I kind of just kept asking myself these what if questions, and the story developed from there. But I think the seed really was, if we look at history, we watch these world powers come and go, and what would happen if that occurred with America? And I think a lot of times in a dystopian worlds, they're typically post-apocalyptic, and the world is all destroyed except for this one small place. And I wanted to kind of explore, well, what would happen if just America was completely destroyed and the rest of the world still moved on, still had all this tech and stuff, but there were pockets of survivors who had kind of learned to live a quieter, different type of life than they'd ever known before. And how would all of that play out in, the grand scheme of things? So that was sort of the big kickoff, I think, for this story, and wanting to explore some of those deeper themes as well. How do you find hope in dark times, and what does it look like for a character who gets thrust into this crazy world without, can she survive there and not be destroyed? That kind of stuff. I think all of those different things came together and were the things that gave me an excitement for this story.
How much world building did you do before you started writing? Because I imagine this was a world you had to imagine. I mean, it was familiar, right? Parts of it surely felt familiar, and yet you had to make it different enough that it captured everybody's imagination. The whole what if had to look very different than it does today. So how much of that did you do before you started writing, and how much did you just sort of wing as you went along?
Right. Well, I think part of that is my writing process has changed. So when I started writing Recruit of Talionis, the seed of this idea, which was a draft that shall never see the light of day because it is terrible, but that very beginning part happened several years ago. And at that time, I just, sat down and I would write. Now I plan and plot a lot more. So that book was written, read by one other person who is my cousin, so she has to still love me because we're family. And despite the fact that it is not a good story, and then it was kind of the seed that got put in the drawer and planted. And then after I learned a lot more about writing and grew as an author, I came back to the story and rewrote it completely. And at that point, I took parts and then I did more world building and planning and plotting and putting the story together. So it kind of was a little bit of both, where it was all just winging it, and then at the beginning, and then later coming back and learning more about different types of technology, different, history even, and things that happened in the past, and how I could kind of use some of that and put it into a story that takes place in the future. And then there's some elements that are fun, that are futuristic tech and that kind of thing, where I learned about the technology and then extrapolated it even further out. What if this happened, and what if we could do it like this but even more crazy? So some of it was planning that then I just kind of had fun winging it in other ways as well. So a little of every part of it to come together and hopefully create a story and a world that is immersive and exciting, but also feels very real, while also having elements that are outside of our world, different from what we know and understand right now.
And did you plan out just book one, or do you have plots and outlines for book two and anything beyond that?
Yeah. So I planned out a general idea of the story arc for the entire series. So it's a 4-book series. It was originally a 3-book series, but then once my editor got a hold of book 1's manuscript, we changed so much in that developmental editing process that it changed my plan for book 2, which ended up needing to make it books 2 and 3. And so therefore it is now a 4-book series. But I have a general plan for the whole series. And then I tend to sit down for the book that I'm working on next and really outline and plan that, and then draft the first draft and edit it and come back to that and kind of make that perfect, and then work on the next book after that. So I have the very roughest outline for everything, but when I'm ready to work on the next story is when I really dive in and create that big overarching scene chart and plan and outline and all of that for that specific book.
Why make this series for a young adult audience? It seems like this could have been written for an adult audience. This could have been an adult sci-fi dystopian series. What was it about the young adult audience, the young adult genre, that made you want to set this story there?
Well, I've spent a lot of time with teens and young adults working with kids in difficult situations and talking with them. And I think I just, I love hanging out with teens and encouraging them in their difficult seasons of life and kind of mentoring them and helping them, and young adults as well. And so I think that age group just is one that really, I see that there's a lot of struggles in that time period of life. I know there's a lot that goes on in different kids' lives, and just wanting to give them a story where they could escape for a little bit, but also feel like they could relate to the characters and relate to what they're going through. And even though this is a world set in the future, maybe have things in it that would resonate in their hearts as well. And I also think teens can express emotions a little more enthusiastically, shall we say, than adults. And sometimes I think that's a little bit of fun to write in a story too. Teens will be a little more ready to be sassy or over the top sometimes than adults will be. And because we try to be more mature as we get older, hopefully, right? But and I think there's something fun about expressing that in a story, because we, even as adults, there's that part inside of us that is screaming like that teen is just actually going to do. She's just going to scream and say what she thinks. And so I think that there's that aspect that I enjoy in young adult stories where we can get into that emotion of the character. And because I've spent so much time working with youth, I think that has been a big part of why I really wanted to write stories that they could enjoy.
What has been the reaction from your readers to this story? And your cousin who read that very first draft, does she she approve of the series as it is now?
Yes, Rachel likes it. Thankfully, she agrees that it is much better and that book one shall never see the light of day. Thank the Lord. So thankfully she's on board with that. But yes, she likes it. And I've gotten great responses from readers. I have had a variety of reader ages, but I have heard from teens specifically who are resonating with the characters. They love the story. They're excited about the next books. I think my youngest reader that I've heard from is 10, which I think is a little young for the series, but it's clean. There's no real gory elements in there. There's just some scary scenes. So if a reader likes scarier things, even if they're young, I guess it's okay that way. But so I've had 10 as my youngest, and then somebody in her late 90s emailed me to tell me she really enjoyed the story and it made her heart pound really fast, which made me nervous. I don't really want to make 98-year-olds hearts pound really fast, but I think that it's just been really neat to see a variety of readers. A lot of men like the book. I've heard from men in the military who read the story and really resonated with it because they are in the military and there are military elements to the book. And my developmental editor, he's a retired Marine veteran, so I give him all the credit for those military resonant points because I was not in the military. So anything that seems real in that sense is thankfully because of him and not because I knew enough to write about it. Really, he just helped me hone that and make it so much better. So yeah, just gotten some great feedback. It's been fun to hear from readers and people who I never expected to pick up the book, honestly, who have picked it up and really enjoyed the characters and the story and the world and gotten invested in it enough to care to reach out to me.
So young adult or young at heart, ages 10 to 98. Is that what the cover's gonna?
I guess so.
Excellent. Well, I want to talk a little bit about your Kickstarter program because I understand you did a pre-release for the series on Kickstarter.
Yes.
What made you decide to do that? What was that like?
Sure. So I really love to find ways to make things more fun and exciting for my readers. And for book one, I wanted to try Kickstarter. I'd heard a lot about it and kind of a great way to test a book idea. See, is this something that people are interested in? Is it something anyone wants to buy? Because it's one thing to pitch the idea to your mom or friends or something, and they're like, oh, it sounds interesting. But once somebody has to pay money for it, it does make a difference. We put our money where our mouth is, so to speak. And so Kickstarter is kind of an interesting way to test my idea, see, is this something people want? And the first one went really well. People were excited about it. They wanted to get involved in the story. They wanted the book early. And that's really the reason I enjoy doing the Kickstarters too, is because I can give the book early to all of my Kickstarter backers. They get it months before it releases anywhere else. And they get a bunch of extra stuff with it. So I can interact with them on Kickstarter. If they buy my book on Amazon, I'm thrilled about that, but I can't interact with them because I don't get that information. Whereas if they buy on Kickstarter, if they back my campaign, I get to interact with them. We get to talk about stretch goals, fun extras that can come into the book that can be a part of it, additional short stories that we can write, that I write to be a part of the world that they'll get through being a part of the Kickstarter, and different things like that. So it provides a way for me to make the book available early and add all of these other elements and extra things so that the reader gets far more than if they just bought it online somewhere else. And for the second book, for Fugitive of Talionis, I think the week after my book officially released, I started getting emails from people asking me when book 2 was coming out, and it wasn't scheduled to come out until this year, 2023. So I was like, well, if you want it early, we can do another Kickstarter. And I had enough people who really wanted the book early. So the Kickstarter happened in the spring, and all of my Kickstarter backers have already gotten Fugitive of Talionis, I think in July, and which is several months before the book officially released in October. So it just gives me a way to give them, my readers, something they're asking for early, and also provide a fun kind of launch for them, for anyone who wants to be involved in that.
Yeah. Is it something you think you will continue to do?
I think for this series, at least, I offer some things on the Kickstarter that I don't offer anywhere else. There are special editions that people can get, and I would hate to special limited editions. So I have 100 copies only of certain versions of the books. And for the people who are buying those copies, I would love to make sure they can get books 3 and 4 in the same version, because I don't know, on the bookshelf, personally, I like to have all of the books in a series look the same. So I would hate to cut somebody off halfway through. So I'll probably do the pre-release for books 3 and 4 as well.
Any advice you would have for somebody who's thinking of doing something similar for their own books or their own series?
I would say that it is a lot of work. And one of the biggest things with Kickstarter is that Kickstarter is not something that's going to bring you an audience automatically. It's a bit like how Amazon, if you publish your book on Amazon, it doesn't mean people are going to buy it. You need to market it. You need to have a group of people you're telling about your story so that they can show up and purchase it. And the same is true with Kickstarter. So if you're going to do a Kickstarter, you need to know you can bring a crowd to Kickstarter first. And if you can do that, Kickstarter will start sending people your way as well, because they'll see that this is a project people are interested in. So they'll let others know, and your project will show up under other campaigns and different things. So you'll get more people coming to your Kickstarter, but it needs to start with you actually doing the work of bringing that first wave of people yourself. So I always like to say that it's part of a marketing plan. It can't be your only marketing idea. Kickstarter is awesome because it brings in money before the book's release and all of that, but you need to have people you're talking about it with. So having an email list that you're regularly interacting with, people who are excited about the book, people who are ready to buy it, that really helps make a Kickstarter successful.
I've noticed you also have a couple of short stories related to the Talionis series. Can you talk a little bit about some of the side stories that you've written?
Sure. So one of the things I did as I was becoming a better writer and learning more about the craft of writing is I wrote short stories, and I found I really enjoyed that, just kind of pulling a scene out of a character's life and writing the short few thousand word story about it, about that person, kind of brought life to my different characters. So for the Talionis series, I started to write different short stories related to different characters. So I have one that is about Demetrius' arc, and it's sort of the pivotal turning point in his life that started him on the track to who he becomes in the Talionis series. Another one is about Laban Meritas, who is probably the most felt antagonist in the first two books because he's directly the soldier directly over Bria and her friends. He's the one who really doles out a lot of punishment. He's not a very likable guy. So that short story gives a little bit of his back history, his why he is the way he is in some ways, the choices he made to become that, but also the tragic things that happened in his past that influenced the decisions he made. I have another story about Essie, who is the Kai, the mentor character in the series. It's his mom, and it takes place during the demise of North America, so you can kind of get a glimpse of that story and of that history of what happened and somebody who is a survivor in that time. And then the other short story is about Cade, and he's a character that a lot of people really love in the series. And so one of the reasons I wrote his story is just because people were really resonating with his character in Recruit of Talionis. So I love having short stories as a way to essentially layer in more information. And for those people who really are enjoying the series, it gives them an opportunity to kind of dive deeper and learn more about the characters. And if they don't really feel like leaving the world after book one or after book two, they can pick up the short stories and learn more. I actually have a companion novel that will come out hopefully at the end of 2023 or beginning of 2024 called Abandoned Shores, which is about a character in book two, Katori. So that is an actual shorter novel instead of a short story that you don't have to read. It can stand on its own. If you want to just read Abandoned Shores, you don't have to read the whole series. But if you just want to read the series and not Abandoned Shores, you don't have to. But the idea with each of these books is that, and each of these stories is that they can layer together to create an even fuller picture if you want that. And if you kind of just love the series world, you can stay there a little bit longer than the end of the book.
Were you always a writer? Is this something you have always done, or is this something that just came to you with this idea for this book?
I was always good at writing. I'm not good at math. I am not good at science. Those were never subjects in school that I excelled in, but I was always good at writing in English, creative writing, all of that kind of stuff. I loved stories. I've always loved reading, but I didn't think of becoming an author until I was in my early 20s. It wasn't something I was never that kid growing up who was like, I always know what I want to be when I grow up. I never knew what I wanted to be when I grew up. So this just kind of was something I discovered later in life, and in a large part because of the teens I was working with at that time. I guess it was probably my mid-20s, really, not my early 20s. And the teens I was working with at that time, just seeing that they needed stories, they loved them, they loved escaping into these other worlds and kind of wanting to provide an opportunity for them to do that, especially the ones who had particularly difficult things going on in their lives, and provide an escape for them, an opportunity to get away and enjoy another world for a little bit and perhaps find some encouragement through that process as well.
What other goals do you have for yourself on this writing journey of yours, other than completing the series?
Of course. Well, I love writing. Now at this point, I'm so thankful that it's something I get to do. I love creating stories and exploring worlds and ideas and what if scenarios. So I look forward to continuing to write different books and different series. I have many other ideas in my head. Some connect to the Talionis series in some way, or at least will be kind of an Easter egg connection, if anything. If nothing else, I should say. And others are completely unrelated, just fun ideas that I would love to explore once I finish this series. But I have many other books that I hope to continue to write for years to come.
Good, good. Well, if people want to learn more about you and your books and look for new releases, that sort of thing, where should they go to find you and that information?
Sure. Probably the best place is my website, which is cjmilacci.com. It's Milacci for Milacci. And that has a sign up for my newsletter, which is probably the best way to find out about everything I'm doing. I keep my newsletter more updated than anywhere else, but I'm also on social media pretty much anywhere at CJ Milacci. Most of the time I spend is on Instagram, some on Facebook, and some on all the other platforms as well. But my biggest focus is Instagram. But even more is my newsletter. They get all of the information about everything that's happening, and they get short stories when they come out and that kind of thing as well. I like to give fun freebies and extras to my email list. So that's the best place to be.
Good. And if people want to pick up a copy of either of the first two books, Recruit of Talionis or Fugitive of Talionis, where should they go to buy them?
They pretty much anywhere online. So Amazon, Barnes & Noble, you can go to your local bookstore and request a copy of either of the books, and they'll be able to order them for you. So it's available really wherever books are sold.
Wonderful. Well, CJ, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast. And I want to wish you luck with the Recruit of Talionis, The Fugitive of Talionis, and books 3 and 4 to come. We will look forward to those. So congratulations on everything you've accomplished so far, and best of luck with the rest of your writing journey.
Thank you so much, Stacy, and thank you for having me today. This was so much fun.
The Bookshop at the End of the Internet is a podcast dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like any good bookshop, this podcast features a wide variety of books by the equally varied and interesting authors who felt compelled to write them. This podcast gives you a chance to meet these wonderful writers and discover your next must-read book. Listen to the authors describe their books and tell you their stories in their own words. My interviews feature books from all genres and authors from all walks of life, including those who are indie published as well as those published by small presses and large publishing houses. Looking for unique, not so easy to find books for yourself, a friend, or a book club? Tune into this podcast and find your newest favorite author or maybe a soon-to-be bestseller. This podcast, like all the best bookshops, is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. Tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book. You never know what treasures you might find in the Bookshop at the End of the Internet.